Hey, what's happening, friends? With all the changes in the real estate industry recently, we've had some changes to our contracts, and I wanted to run you through what the new listing contract looks like and what those changes were. So, if you're looking at selling a home, you're prepared to understand how to have that conversation with your realtor. And so, I'm going to bring up the contract here so you can see it. This is the brand new contract that was just released about a month ago. And so there's some significant changes to the way compensation is handled for the buyer's brokerage. And as we've talked about in the past, the listing broker would negotiate with the seller a commission amount, and then they would usually split that commission amount and give half of it to a buyer's brokerage. Due to the changes, that is no longer the case. Our company in particular will not do that, even though it's kind of allowed. You just can't advertise it on the MLS. We are no longer going to do broker to broker compensation, but there are some provisions in the new listing contract that allow for a seller, if a seller chooses to continue to provide an incentive to a buyer's brokerage or to a buyer for purchasing their home. So the first parts of the contract, pretty much the same, no significant changes. So I'm not going to go through these in detail. I'm going to start down here at A7. So we have the listing price in A4. That's pretty straightforward. We have the listing period, how long it's going to be for. And then in A7, we have the brokerage firm. And this is the dollar amount that that listing broker and that seller will negotiate for the service that that listing broker will provide to put the house on the market. This will not include any additional compensation or incentive to a buyer broker for bringing a buyer to the table. And then there's an addition here with B, paragraph B in this section. This is interesting because you can agree or negotiate with your broker on whether or not you will pay more or less for a buyer that is unrepresented. So if a buyer comes to the table without representation, a lot of times as a listing broker, we understand it's going to be a lot of additional work because we have to handle the contracts for both sides, inspections, scheduling. We have to keep them informed of the timelines. And so when a buyer comes unrepresented, it's actually not necessarily a good thing for the seller because they don't have any professional guidance in that process and sometimes don't adhere to the timelines, and they can make the transaction a little bit more stressful. So in that case, you can negotiate with your broker. I would say that I would, as a listing broker, want an additional fee to handle all that additional work. And so we're going to talk about that in paragraph B of the listing contract. So this just handles compensation to the broker that you are hiring to put your house on the market and get it sold. And then there's two additional paragraphs now that talk about compensation to the buyer's brokerage firm. And there's a couple of different options here. So they're handled separately. So if a seller wants to offer compensation through the listing brokerage, they can choose A and put an amount here. And again, this is something that our brokerage personally is not doing. We will never agree to option A in this paragraph because we will not share commissions we will not collect commissions and then share them with a buyer brokerage. But we would do B. So in B, the seller can offer an amount and pay directly to the buyer's brokerage. So the money would not flow through the listing brokerage. It would be paid directly from the seller to the buyer's brokerage. And you can elect to do that in option B, or you can select option C, that you will negotiate with the buyer's broker at the time of an offer through their representative and hash it out at that time, so you don't do any prior offer of compensation to the buyer's brokerage firm. So this is handled in paragraph C4 of the purchase contract. Is this number would then be put into the purchase contract, and that's where it would be agreed upon between both parties, is in the purchase contract. So irregardless of what you as a seller agree to here, if a buyer doesn't ask for that amount, you could actually not have to pay that amount, or a buyer could always ask for more, and you would have to then negotiate that in the purchase contract and then settle upon an agreeable amount to both parties. So this is direct compensation from the seller to the brokerage firm. The next option is in paragraph A9. So right below that is a concession to the buyer. So in this case, this has been handled in the past. This is not a new thing, but the way it's going to be handled is a little bit different. So sellers could always make a concession to a buyer and say, hey, the roof needs to be replaced. I will credit you $20,000 at closing for the roof. And so you could specify an amount here that says exactly what you're willing to pay from the seller to the buyer, and then the buyer can apply that money towards whatever cost they see fit. A lot of times now, this is one way that a buyer is going to compensate their broker, is they're going to ask for a concession from the seller, and then they will collect the funds as the buyer and then pay for their representation or their loan fees or their title and escrow fees or repairs or whatever it is that they deem fit to pay for post closing. So this is another way that, again, we've talked about in the past. The money flows a little bit differently, but at the end of the day, it accomplishes the same thing. And an important thing to understand as a seller in all of this is there's been a lot of talk that, sellers are no longer going to have to pay buyer agent commissions. You never had to. It was always negotiable. But the thing you have to consider as a seller is, even if you do not offer any compensation and you don't want to pay for any type of compensation, you have the absolute right to do that. A buyer also has the absolute right to ask and negotiate for it, right? So that cost does not go away. And if you're dealing with a buyer who maybe doesn't have the additional cash to close, or maybe a low down payment buyer and needs some assistance with closing costs, they're going to ask for that in the contract. So as a seller, just be prepared that this is going to happen at the time of offer, irregardless if you offer it or not. In many, many cases, and we'll have market data on this here shortly, in many cases, buyers are going to continue to ask for some type of concession or compensation to help them with the cost of representation, because that's the normal course of business that buyers and sellers have been used to for many, many years. So just remember, the cost doesn't disappear. It's still got to be paid for one way or another. It's just going to be negotiated and worked into the contract in a different way. So make sure you have this conversation in depth with your agent and you understand the process and what's going to happen, because regardless of what you put into your listing contract, what you get when purchase contracts come could be different, better or worse, depending on how you're looking at it. But you are no longer pre-negotiating a set amount that you are going to pay a buyer broker. That's a good thing for you as a seller, because negotiating it at the time of sale could save you some money. If your home has been on the market for 6 months and you can't find a buyer, and it's a buyer that really needs additional help on their closing costs, you may have to come out of pocket a little bit more to help them with those costs. So lots of different scenarios. You want to make sure you're working with a professional that really understands how all the different options can play out, and they can explain them to you and help put you in the position to best net the highest amount of money possible for your home. Sometimes that will mean offering some compensation up front and taking that largest piece of the negotiation off the table. So as always, if you have any questions, just reach out, dylan@buybigisland.com, or you can book a meeting in the link below, and I'll get back to you guys. Thanks for watching. Aloha.